Hi guys, today I'm going to read Encyclopedia Brown and the Case of the Mysterious Handprints. So I'm going to do 2 of the chapters today, and then next week I'll post another couple of ones. First one, so Encyclopedia Brown is a boy detective, and he's very good at solving them, so I'll read the chapter. I would pause the video before I read you who did it or how he figured out the answers, so you can try to figure it out too. Okay. I know it's not that fun just to stare at my face, but there's really no pictures in this. There was more to Idaville than met the eye. To passing motorists, Idaville looked like an ordinary seaside town. It had lovely beaches, Little League, and 2 delicatessens. It had churches, a synagogue, and 4 banks. To police chiefs all over the country, however, Idaville was far from ordinary. No one got away with breaking a law in Idaville. How did Idaville do it? What was the secret behind the town's spotless police record? Only 2 grown-ups, Mr. and Mrs. Brown, knew the answer. Idaville's war on crime was masterminded by their only child, a 10-year-old encyclopedia, America's Sherlock Holmes in sneakers. Mr. Brown, oh, I do have a picture for you to look at. Great. Mr. Brown was the Idaville police chief. He was a fine officer, brave and smart. But sometimes he came up against a crime that even he could not solve. When that happened, he knew what to do. He drove home at dinner table, went over the facts of the case, while Encyclopedia listened carefully. Nothing else was necessary. Encyclopedia usually figured out the guilty person before dessert. If he needed a few minutes extra, his mother was disappointed. Chief Brown hated keeping his son sleuthing undercover. He would have liked the president to declare Encyclopedia a national treasure. But if he told the truth, who would believe him? Who would believe that the mastermind behind Idaville's crackdown on crime didn't look in the mirror after washing to see if his face was clean? He looked in his towel. As for Encyclopedia, he never told anyone about the help he gave his father. He didn't want to seem different from other 5th graders. He was stuck with his nickname, however. Only his parents and teachers called him by his real name, Leroy. Everyone else called him Encyclopedia. An encyclopedia is a book or a set of books filled with facts from A to Z. So was Encyclopedia's head. He had read more books than anyone in Idaville, and he never forgot what he read. His pals insisted that he was better than a library. They learned all kinds of things about books from him, such as footnotes don't come from squeaky shoes. At the dinner table, Friday evening, Chief Brown poked at his meatloaf. Encyclopedia and his mother knew what that meant. A case had puzzled him. Chief Brown put down his fork. There was trouble at the yacht club this morning, he said at last. Someone smashed the rudder of Defiance. Isn't Defiance one of the sailboats in the Commodore's Cup finals? Mrs. Brown inquired. Defiance is racing childhood too, replied Chief Brown. Whichever boat wins 2 out of 3 races will be awarded the Commodore's Cup for the year. Yesterday, Defiance won the opening race. Encyclopedia had read about the Commodore's Cup finals in the Idaville News. Defiance was owned and sailed by Mr. and Mrs. Ernest Day. Childhood 2 was owned and sailed by John Cushing and his brother Tom. Childhood 2 was faster in light seas. Defiance was faster in rough seas. With Mr. Day at the helm, Defiance had sliced through angry waves yesterday to win by more than 2 minutes. Why don't you give Leroy the facts about the smashed rudder, dear? Mrs. Brown suggested. He'll figure out who did it. Chief Brown smiled and withdrew a small notebook from his breast pocket. Here's what I have, he said. At 7 o'clock, now you got to pay attention to the facts. At 7 o'clock that morning, the night watchman at the yacht club went off duty. As he was leaving, a cleaning woman arrived. A few minutes later, the woman glanced out the window and saw a blond man carrying a hammer. He was walking out on Pier 2 toward the slip where Defiance was tied up. A light rain was falling. The cleaning woman didn't bother about the man. No more than 10 minutes passed when she happened to glance out the same window. The pier was deserted. The man was gone. Chief Brown said, so as far as I can tell, no one else was on the pier until 8 o'clock. Then 5 or 6 men and women arrived to take out their boats. That's when the smashed rudder on Defiance was discovered. Do you think the blond man is responsible? Mrs. Brown asked. Perhaps, Chief Brown answered cautiously. He flipped a page in his notebook. The manager of the yacht club telephoned Mr. Day, owner of Defiance, Chief Brown continued. After examining the rudder himself, Mr. Day called me. He said the rudder couldn't be repaired in time for today's race, which was to start at noon, so the second race had to be postponed until tomorrow. That's a tough break for the Cushion brothers, Encyclopedia said. The seas were calm today. Childhood, too, might have beaten Defiance and squared the series at 1 victory apiece. True, Chief Brown said, but one of the brothers might have smashed the rudder, hoping that it would not be repaired at all. What a horrible example of sportsmanship, Mrs. Brown said. I feel so sorry for the Days. They're among the best-liked couples at the yacht club. I questioned the Cushion brothers, Chief Brown said. They don't have an alibi for 7 o'clock, when the blonde man was on the pier. They insisted they were eating breakfast. They could be lying. They live alone, and no one saw them at breakfast. What about Mr. and Mrs. Day? Asked Mrs. Brown. Mr. Day said he and Mrs. Day were still sleeping at 7 o'clock. Like the Cushion brothers, the Days live alone, and like the brothers, there's no one to support their story. Chief Brown leafed through several pages of his notebook. Shortly before 9 o'clock this morning, he said, Mr. Day drove his wife to the beauty parlor. There is a supper dance at the yacht club tonight, and she wanted to have her hair set. Mr. Day said that he had just returned home when the phone rang. It was the manager of the yacht club calling. According to Mr. Day, that was when he learned about Defiance's smashed rudder. Mrs. Brown looked at Encyclopedia out of the corner of her eye. He had not asked his question. Usually he solved the toughest mysteries with one question. If only the cleaning woman had recognized that man, she declared. She saw only his back, Chief Brown said. Oh, I nearly forgot. I found a blonde wig on top of the trash can outside the kitchen of the yacht club. The cleaning woman swears the wig wasn't there when she came to work. Mrs. Brown looked at Encyclopedia again. She seemed to expect him to solve the case, now that he knew about the blonde wig. Encyclopedia had closed his eyes. He always closed his eyes when he did his deepest thinking on a case. But he wasn't ready to ask yet his one question. So Mrs. Brown said, What color hair do John and Tom Cushion have? And Mr. and Mrs. Day? The Cushion brothers have dark hair, Chief Brown replied. Mr. Day's hair is blonde. Mrs. Day is a redhead. Suddenly, Encyclopedia opened his eyes. He asked his question. Dad, did you check with the beauty parlor to see if Mr. Day drove his wife there this morning, as he claims? He told the truth, Chief Brown stated. One of the beauticians saw him drive Mrs. Day up to the door. Leroy, Mrs. Brown exclaimed. The rudder of the Day's sailboat was smashed around 7 o'clock. They reached the beauty parlor some 2 hours later. What has one got to do with the other? Everything, Mom, replied Encyclopedia. So the question is, why? Why? Can you figure out the answer? Let me go to the solution while you're thinking. Here we go. Did anybody figure it out? See? Maybe you, Matthew. I know you like these books. The case of the blonde wig. Mr. Day wanted the second race postponed. The calm sea favored the Cushion's boat. However, he didn't want to commit a crime by damaging their boat, so he damaged his own. He wore a blonde wig and left it where it could be found. Since he was a blonde, he thought to cast suspicion on the dark-haired Cushons. He claimed that he first learned about the smash rudder when the yacht club manager telephoned him after he had driven Mrs. Day to have her hair set. Therefore, Encyclopedia realized, the Days already knew the race would be postponed. Mrs. Day would never have had her hair set a few hours before competing in a sailboat race. Her new hairdo would have been blown apart in the wind. Ooh. I did not figure that out. I thought it might have been them, but I didn't know. I didn't have proof. I was like the dad. All right, I'll do another one later. Bye.